Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is solution-focused therapy? Solution-focused therapy, which is sometimes referred to as solution-focused brief therapy, was developed by Shazer and Berg in the 1980s. And there is no theory behind this therapy. A lot of modern modalities have some sort of theory associated with them. Solution-focused therapy does not. It's not theory-driven. It's considered a positive approach, and it's also considered a constructivist approach. So solution-focused therapy is considered to be collaborative and collegial, as opposed to confrontational, instructive, or needing to have an interpretation component. Many of the modern theories that we see do have confrontational, instructive, and interpretive components to them. Now, even though solution-focused therapy is not theory-based, there are principles and techniques associated with it. The first is that problems form in the context of human interaction. Now, this is a bit different than, say, reality therapy, which looks at problems formed because of relationships. In solution-focused therapy, interactions could include relationships, but they're not exclusively relationships. The objective in solution-focused therapy is to encourage a client to do something different. So the idea here is that any change is a good change. Any change moves somebody further away from the problem. Now, of course, we recognize in mental health treatment that all change isn't good. There can be negative change as well. For example, if someone comes into treatment because they are consuming too much alcohol, and the change they make is to consume more alcohol, that would be recognized as negative. In solution-focused therapy, there isn't really an emphasis on directionality too much, although generally, of course, a positive change would be recognized as superior to a negative change. In solution-focused therapy, the client is the expert. The modality does recognize that in all therapy there is a hierarchy, but the wisdom of the client is seen as the most valuable contribution into the therapeutic process. The therapist is not an expert, and again, there's no real instructive component to this therapy. One of the goals of the therapist in solution-focused therapy is to help the client to make contact with forgotten and unnoticed wisdom. So the client comes to therapy with everything they need to make the change that would eliminate the problem. We see this component in a number of other therapeutic modalities as well. A type of this component we would see in person-centered therapy, Rogerian therapy. So another feature of solution-focused therapy is that resistance helps the therapist to know how to help the client. So resistance is interpreted as positive. It adds knowledge to the therapeutic process. So in a way, with resistance being thought of as valuable, solution-focused therapy is similar to motivational interviewing. So to deal with resistance, a therapist tries to build cooperation. And in solution-focused therapy, this is connecting the present to the future. The past is largely ignored in solution-focused therapy, except for exceptions to the problem. So this would be when the problem was not around, when it was not apparent. Of course, this would occur in the past, and this would be emphasized. But most of the time would be spent on the present and how things can get better, can get more positive in the future. Another technique in solution-focused therapy is reframing. And this technique in this therapy is very similar to what we see in some cognitive behavioral therapies, like Beckian Cognitive Therapy or Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy developed by Albert Ellis. So new meaning can be developed as the therapist listens to the client's narrative. And this new meaning would be conveyed to the client and would usually, we would hope, end up in the problem being eliminated or being reduced in severity and a positive direction being adopted. Goals in solution-focused therapy need to be small and achievable. So remember, with this therapy, almost any change is favored over no change, particularly any positive change. So the goals being small and achievable is consistent with that mentality, with that ideology. A lot of other modalities have large goals, and sometimes it's difficult to break those down into smaller objectives. Solution-focused therapy addresses this directly by doing away with large goals and instead favoring small goals that can be measured. So there's a pragmatic quality here to goal setting in solution-focused therapy. In this modality, there is no need for a detailed description of the problem. A lot of the principles and techniques of solution-focused therapy are quite a bit different than other modalities, as I mentioned. This particular principle really differentiates solution focus quite a bit, particularly from cognitive behavioral therapies. Usually with a version of CBT, it's important to have a detailed description of the problem. Problems are different for everybody. Each individual is unique. Solution-focused therapy doesn't really have this same emphasis. A solution-focused therapist would be okay with having a detailed description of the problem. It's just considered not necessary. There are a number of other techniques that are fairly popular with solution-focused therapy. One is the miracle question, and this is a question that's asked to the client, where the clients ask if they went to bed and when they woke up the problem was gone, how would they know? So in a sense, one of the purposes of this question is diagnostic. Another, of course, is to find out what can be changed to alleviate the problem. Seeing how somebody would recognize the problem is gone if they just woke up and it was miraculously gone can be helpful. And the miracle question is used by a number of integrative therapists that integrate solution-focused therapy into their primary modality or modalities. Another common technique is the exception to the problem, or the identification of the exception. In solution-focused therapy, it's believed that a problem can't be continuous throughout a client's life. There have to be times when it's not there. And these exceptions are valuable because they can help the therapist and the client realize how to find a solution. This is very consistent with a minimal focus on the past. This is the only area where a solution-focused therapist, as I mentioned, would focus on the past. Another common technique in solution-focused therapy is scaling, and we see this in a number of other modalities as well. So this is often done with a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most severe manifestation of a problem. Now this is consistent with the goals being measurable in solution-focused therapy. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of solution-focused therapy? Well, one of the advantages of this modality is that it has been generally supported in the research as being effective. It can be argued that solution-focused therapy has not really shown its effectiveness with a wide range of disorders, particularly disorders that are usually thought of as more severe. But as I mentioned, generally it has been shown to be effective. The therapy is also brief. Now this can be considered an advantage or a disadvantage depending on one's point of view. Usually though, I would view this as a positive if a modality has the capability of being brief. Another positive aspect to this modality is small and achievable goals. I think this makes a lot of sense, and I do believe a lot of other modalities set very ambitious goals that can be difficult to achieve, and this can be discouraging for a client. Now, in terms of disadvantages, there are some limitations and criticisms we see for solution-focused therapy. The first is that the reality is constructed through conversation, meaning solution-focused therapy is a constructivist approach. The idea is that the therapist and the client co-construct solutions, but in a sense really co-construct reality. So this has a postmodern philosophical orientation to it, similar to what we see with narrative therapy. Like many aspects of this modality, this limitation could also be viewed as a positive. I think one of the problems that I have with the constructivist perspective we see with solution-focused therapy and with narrative therapy is that it seems to sidestep empiricism. It seems to sidestep the scientific method, meaning there's no universal truth with solution-focused therapy. I don't think this is always the most useful way to frame a therapeutic modality, and I believe there's inherent problems when you don't have a universal truth to work with. But this is a matter of opinion. As I mentioned, some people see this as a positive aspect. Another common criticism of this modality is that it doesn't fully respect a client's history. And that's because there's no detailed description of the problem required in solution-focused therapy. So the conversation in therapy tends to stay more on the surface and doesn't have a lot of depth. Other criticisms include that solution-focused therapy is relativistic, minimalistic, and the brief therapy component that it has, as I mentioned, could also be a positive. But in terms of the negative side of it, there's a danger that if a client has a more serious mental health disorder or one that necessitates longer-term care, that need would be overlooked by the brief orientation we see in solution-focused therapy. So overall, solution-focused therapy is an interesting therapy. Compared to a lot of other modalities, it looks at the client's problem and possible solutions from a different angle. It's not without its limitations. However, I see solution-focused therapy as a modality that can be easily integrated into other modalities. As I mentioned before, it's not unusual for some of the techniques of solution-focused therapy to make their way into cognitive behavioral therapies as well as a number of other modalities. I hope you found this description of solution-focused therapy to be interesting. Thanks for watching.